Thank you so much, Fernando. And Charles, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I want to start uh, first by expressing my gratitude to, as you know, I've been enormously influenced by your writings. Uh, and so has Celo in general. And also just, I want to express my gratitude for your friendship. I always feel great after the two of us chat. And so I'm looking forward to another conversation together.
Yeah, me too. I'll just echo that. And my gratitude, like sometimes I can't believe it when somebody actually applies the things I write about. Because, central banks and governments haven't quite gotten around to it yet. But there are people like yourself who are working with these concepts. And when they actually work and they actually spread and inspire people and other people get it, I understand that I'm not crazy. So the gratitude is very much mutual here.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, that's actually a nice kind of like a nice prompt to start the conversation. And maybe I'll start off with a story that I often tell, which is a story about mycelial network. So I was reading a book a few months back called The Hidden Life of Trees. And in it talked about mycelial networks, which are, we know above ground as mushrooms, but below ground, there's thousands of miles of mycelium for every square foot of forest. And trees use them to communicate with one another. And when you look at mycelium under a microscope, it looks like a nervous system. And in fact, it is a nervous system. It is a network, a communications network that allows communication and computation within and between living species. And that, we could go two ways with that. The first is we could say, what does that say in a world where we know that our own human intelligence emerges from the neural networks in our brains and our guts and our hearts, and in a world where we know that much shallower neural networks lead to kind of our artificial intelligence? What does that say for the intelligence of forests, whose neural networks are much, much deeper and more intricate than those of our own human brains? And I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I imagine you do too. And there's a second place we can go, which is like when a forest has a nervous system, well, what is the organism? Is it a tree or is it the forest? And basically, kind of when you think about that for longer than a minute, you just come to the inescapable conclusion. And not just when you look at that, but when you look at ant colonies or beehives, or the fact that we have 10 times more bacterial cells in our body than human cells, or the fact that our mitochondria have different DNA than we do, we just can only come to the one conclusion that we are at every level, from cell all the way to Earth, both organism and ecosystem. We are at the same time a whole and a part. And the science fiction writer Arthur Koestler talked about this, and he invented a word for something that is at the same time a whole and a part, which is holons. And the truth is, like, I don't need to know about mycelial networks to feel that truth. Like, I feel like I am a whole, and at the same time, I feel like I am a part of something greater than myself. And it is that truth that kind of underlies a lot of and we'll talk about this more, a lot of the actual technical primitives that we've implemented in Celo. But it strikes me, and this is where I want to start the conversation, it strikes me that like, even though like that truth is pretty well felt, I think most of society is organized as if the opposite were true. If we take a look at if we take a look at kind of, say, the modern suburbs, for example, like homes look like one another, and at the same time, they don't have the common spaces for gathering, the courtyards, and so on. And so I wanted to kind of get a sense from you as to why you think this is the case. Why do you think that this truth of being a whole and being a part, having a unique purpose and being connected to one another, is not as well supported in our society as you can imagine it could be?
Yeah, well, that's a very long story, how this whole situation came about, where we live in a society that casts us into the role of separate selves. And once we're in that role, then we continue to wield a narrative and build systems that reflect that role. So the system creates the individual, and the individual creates the system. So we're kind of like in this holding pattern, or this gestalt, which is itself an organism, you could say, a being that goes through an evolution, and in our time is maybe reaching a stage where it's ready to molt, or ready to have a phase transition. So like this, the mycelial connections in a forest. One thing that I think is important also to understand about that is that this is not the only way that trees or plants in the forest communicate. It's just one of the means by which they're woven together into a holon. It's also aromatic chemicals that they sense from each other, and viruses and bacteria that transmit information from one to another, and even birds, and I mean, the whole thing, just like the body, there are many, many systems that link the body. You have a lot of cells. I mean, the cells can, to some degree, live independently for a while anyway. Like, you can take them out of your body and grow them in a lab and stuff. And of course, they're also like, you are not just a collection of cells. So and then we can extend that to society as well. So here we have a truth that you're speaking of, that we can both observe in nature and feel in ourselves when we're honest. Like, it has a social dimension too. Like, am I the discrete, separate individual of Adam Smith and Rene Descartes? Well, if I isolate myself, then who I am changes. If I'm in a different social setting, who I am changes. If I go to spend a year in Africa, like, who I am changes. If I go to a float tank, have you ever done one of those? Like these?
I have not yet.
Yeah, and like, if you stay in there long enough, you start to, like, who you are normally becomes irrelevant. So here we have ourselves, the truth of ourselves as interconnected beings, as interexistent beings, as social beings, as ecological beings, and to date, a money system, a financial system that denies that truth, that renders us separate. And I think that this is maybe a deep foundation of the work of Celo, and like, what do we do about this?
Yeah. And so, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, I mean, you could imagine how this happens. Like, a story of the world emerges, and that story is influential on the actual implementation of the world. And so the story of, for example, the story of the factory, for example, the story of industrialization is an incredibly powerful story. And that story has served like a great purpose for a lot of reasons. But at a certain point, it becomes over-applied. So I think about this context. I think about the Secretary of Education in 1906 had said something like, schools should be factories where the raw materials are children and the finished product is labor for the workforce. And you see how that metaphor, that story kind of through metaphor, has shaped generations of school in a way that's likely not appropriate for the true flourishing of the, the raw material, so to speak, you know? And so I'm curious as to what you would say was, like, more concretely, was the story behind the current financial system, and what kind of metaphors could you imagine being applied for a new financial system?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start just to comment a little bit about the factory.
Yeah.
The reason that we have over-applied it is because it was so successful at doing what factories can do, or more generally, what the methodology of breaking a process into minute parts, standardizing those parts, and enacting that on a mass scale. Like, that methodology can achieve incredible things. And its success made us think that we could conquer the entire universe with that method and apply it to everything. We got dizzy with the success. But in fact, as we have discovered, it's only good for certain things, and other things, we'll discover this about AI as well. Like, there are certain things that it's incredibly good at, much better than a human brain, and other things that it is where it hits a glass ceiling very quickly. And until that happens, maybe we over-apply that too. So yeah, as far as the financial system, I kind of mentioned it before, like, our current economic system is based on a story of, it's actually two stories that are tightly twined together. The story of the separate self and the story of conquest and growth. So and we have a financial system that sometimes, even against our inclinations, renders us into separate competing individuals, where our impulse to give, our impulse towards generosity, our impulse to take the time to help somebody out with something, these impulses run up against economic pressure. Can I afford to do that? So to be generous with your time, with your money, and so forth, requires swimming against the tide of the economic system. And the other feature that it implements of our civilization's mythology is the story of growth, that narrates human destiny as the progressive conquest of nature, the conversion of the earth into property, the domestication of the wild, the growth of the human realm. And we have a money system, an economic system that actually only works with growth, and it compels growth, creates growth, doesn't work without growth. So, and that's a good thing in that old story of where, you know, it's human progress is to break through one frontier after another, onward and upward, to cover the whole earth with ourselves. Like, in that story, our economic system works great. Maybe you and I, and probably most people listening, are not quite so inspired by the vision of covering the earth in concrete anymore. But if you look at the Jetsons, that used to be inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I'm always mindful of, you know, and when you look at the Jetsons, it was because of precisely what you said. That was useful at the time. It's not that the story was not inappropriate. It was that the story has outlived its utility. In some ways, that story of the domestication of the wild, one could imagine, is what allowed our current population, or populations above a density that can support hunter-gatherers, because that ideology allowed for agriculture.
And symphony orchestras and literature, and like so many beautiful things. Like, you can't say, well, that was all a big mistake.
Right. Um, and what we can say is we can say, well, I mean, we are starting to reach the carrying capacity of the Earth, and it's not clear that we will grow ourselves out of that problem, basically. And so, let's talk about kind of the features of the existing financial system that leads to this, what you had just referred to as kind of this feeling of scarcity and competition. And I'm recalling Bernard Lietaer had written a little parable in which he had somebody comes to a town where there's no money, and he gives everybody 10 leather tokens, and he says, use these as your medium for exchange, but just give me 11 tokens back next year. And at the time, people said, well, where will we get that 11th token? And he said, well, you'll see. And basically kind of what happened was, the truth was they had to get that 11th token from the existing pool of tokens, basically. So in order to get an 11th token, somebody else had to have 9 tokens, which meant that they would default. And so you all of a sudden introduced a scarcity, and you introduced then competition in that context of scarcity. And then kind of in that context, like things like in the context of scarcity, fear and greed are totally normal. They're like the way that you would react to that environment. But the key point, and I think this is a point that you make, the key point is that that fear and greed is not necessarily kind of human nature. It is human nature in the context of an introduced scarcity. And one way to kind of, one tweak to the financial system that we could do to address that is by introducing a way to create money that is not concomitant with the creation of new debt. So right now, all new money is created through interest-bearing debt. And so if there were other ways of creating money, then that piece would be addressed. A lot of what people see as kind of a failure of capitalism is not so much a failure of capitalism, so much as it is a consequence of the way that money is brought into existence today. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, a lot there, right. It's not a failure of capitalism, it's a failure of capitalism as we know it, which is defined as by capital as we know it. Capital being money and property, which are themselves nothing but social agreements. And these agreements could change. One of the agreements being how money is created. I just want to kind of footnote here quickly. A lot of money today is created without interest-bearing debt on one level because bond prices are so low. So central banks are creating essentially interest-free money.
Right.
But that free money is only reaching a very, very tiny part of the population. Most of the money that gets into the real world of where people are using it is coming with a lot more interest than that. Anyway, yeah, so that story of the 11th round, it's called, right? Yeah. He goes in there, and pretty soon everybody's in competition with each other because they are, at least a tenth of them are going to have to go bankrupt in order for the rest to pay him back. So I added an addendum to that story. And I said, well, actually, that it never happens that a tenth of them go bankrupt, because by the time those debts come due, he's ready to lend more tokens into existence. So there will be enough to cover most of the debts. But who does he lend them to? He's not just anybody. He's going to lend them to people who are likely to be able to pay him back, those that are producing more chickens and more what we call goods and services. So that's where the growth imperative comes from. The way that it creates competition, and this point about human nature, I want to use another parable that I developed by the musical chairs. story, the game of musical chairs.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine like we have everybody on this call. I don't know how many there are. Say there's 1,000 of us, okay? And we set up a giant game of musical chairs. And there's 950 chairs and 1,000 people. And the music starts and then it stops. And all of us, if we were allowed to do this in person, all of us, we could probably do an online version, but all of us like scramble for a chair, elbowing each other and pushing each other. Why do we care so much about getting a chair in this game? Well, because to make it interesting, we've set it up so that if you lose, if you don't get a chair, then you also lose your house and your kids go hungry. So except for a very few altruistic individuals, everybody's pushing and shoving and elbowing and competing and ruthlessly in order to get a chair. And watching this whole melee, sitting back watching it, there's an economist, a politician, and a priest, and a biologist, let's say too. And the biologist says, look at this, human nature, biology, everybody struggling with each other for reproductive self-interest. And the economist says, yep, human beings, all in it for themselves, rational self-interest. And the politician says, lucky thing they've got me around to protect them from each other. And the priest says, I'm going to go in there and try to convince them to be nicer to each other. And what none of those four are doing is changing the system that generates what they think is human nature. But what would your life be like if you were in a situation where there wasn't scarcity, where there were 1,000 people and 1,000 chairs, and the work of the economy was to connect each person to just the right chair for them? There still might be some trade, there still might be some competition, but you wouldn't have a threat to survival baked into the economic system. And that's like these spiritual teachings about abundance. This is their systemic implementation. We don't have to have a world that generates endless competition and endless growth, as an excuse to put more chairs in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So this actually kind of it's a really nice kind of segue to kind of start to get to brass tacks. Like how can we create systems like this, create systems that allow for more prosperity for all. So, I mean, one of the things that I've observed previously has been kind of like monetary policy, like conversations about monetary policy are historically have been both extremely intense. There are like strong views, there are fights basically, but also the range of discourse is extremely narrow. It's like this interest rate versus this interest rate. And so nowhere close to the kinds of things that you're talking about, basically, of saying, okay, well, how about not using debt? How about having alternative means of creating the medium for exchange outside of debt, basically, And so I think part of the reason for that, both that the fights have been intense and the range of discourse has been narrow, is because money right now is a monopoly. There's only one kind of money. And so as a consequence, like any change to any change to monetary policy affects everybody. And I mean, this is one of the things that I've been enthused about with crypto. There's lots of different potential medium of exchange, and each cryptocurrency has its own monetary policy. And so there's and at the beginning it affects few people, like the number of people who are using that cryptocurrency. And so it allows for both the conversation to be more less intense because the impacts are not as big initially. And also because people can always opt out, and say, well, I'll just use this other cryptocurrency with this different monetary policy. So let me just pause there to get your thoughts and reactions, because I want to go through some specific features for Celo, but I just wanted to get your initial reactions on kind of crypto as a way to start exploring ideas that would be much more difficult to explore in the context of a single monetary policy for a single monetary system.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot to unpack there. I would just start by saying that most cryptocurrencies are not actually media of exchange.
Not yet. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Celo is mostly not a medium of exchange, although Celo dollars is.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And this is, one of the ways in which Celo is a very, kind of on a cutting edge. I won't say the cutting edge, because there are other cutting edges in different directions.
Right.
But it's one of the first, I think, to really recognize that that there's maybe a necessity for two layers, just as in the standard economy, actually. Like, you have bank reserves, and then you have the money that people use that's built on top of that. So it's, and we talked a little bit about this before we recorded, like how debt isn't a bad thing. There are certain kinds of economic activity that probably should be financed by interest-bearing debt, namely the risky ones. And it's going to be, if we transition to even like an entire crypto-based economy, like a digital currency, blockchain-based economy, it would be very hard to prevent interest-bearing lending from happening.
In fact, we would want it. Yes. I mean, like, I think about kind of there in companies that I've been involved with, I prefer debt to equity investment.
Right.
So.
Right. But the thing is, and I think this is one of the things that crypto makes possible, or at least gets us thinking about. We actually wouldn't need crypto to do this. It was Abraham Lincoln did it in the 1860s by issuing greenbacks. But that debt, interest-bearing debt, should not be the only way to create money, because there are things in the world that deserve monetary support that you don't want to condition that support, and you're going to have to make even more money back.
Yeah.
So I think, for example, educational loans should not bear interest. Just to take one really concrete example. So
and I mean, there's both, and this is nice. I mean, basically, kind of, there's almost three components that we're talking about. One is basically debt more generally, and basically kind of thinking about how it is useful for debt to bear interest if it is risky. If it is not risky, then if there's zero risk, if there is such a thing, if there is zero risk, zero inflation, zero liquidity premium, basically, then interest on debt basically becomes a reward for having money. And so basically, kind of, one would imagine that basically kind of it is a better world if we have interest-bearing debt that accurately reflects the risks and liquidity costs of debt, and not more than that. And that can happen by just increasing the number of people who can give loans. I mean, this is, I think, one of the things that I'm excited about vis-a-vis DeFi, is that it allows the market to price debt appropriate to the risk of that debt. But there's a second whole thing, which is kind of how do we bring money into existence, And I think the point you're making here is that even if we just added a single complementary way to bring money into existence, that will allow growth to not be the sole imperative to keeping the financial system alive. So, for example, Just to make it very concrete, I had written an essay at one point where um, I said, people should be able to, in addition to uh, either instead of or in addition to debt-based money, people should be able to earn money into existence by planting trees. Um, and the whole rest of the financial infrastructure could then stay the same. Like there could be banks, those banks could create money and lend that money out at interest. Um, but in order to do so, they would have to employ lots of people to reforest our forests, basically. And that's a lovely conceptualization for the role of a bank. Um, and so what I want to do actually is we're getting into this. I wanted to kind of talk about um, 5 features of money that kind of uh, the the reason for the coming into existence of Celo was to build financial primitives to support these 5 features, and I'll talk about the 5 features. They're very influenced and inspired by sacred economics, so I won't go too far into detail on them in this, but maybe we can dive and have a discussion on each of them. So the first one was precisely this. It was the ability to create money without creating new debt. Um, the second is a universal basic income. The third is demurrage. The fourth is natural capital-backed currencies. And the fifth is, for lack of a better word, I call it an ecology of value. It's kind of community currencies and local, regional, functional currencies all interoperating within the same ecosystem. And so let me actually dive into one at a time, and I'll give a little bit of framing. I'd love for your thoughts and commentary, and then to the extent that is appropriate, I could talk a little bit about how they're implemented in Celo. So I'd love to start with natural capital-backed currencies. I had kind of seen all of the others, except for natural capital-backed currencies, when I read your book, when I read Sacred Economics. And so I'd love for you to give kind of like a high-level overview of. I mean, it's a beautiful idea. I'd love for you to give a high-level overview of it. And I mean, just out of pure personal curiosity, I'd love to hear how you came up with that idea, because that's one of the most potentially powerful ideas I've ever seen. So I want to just have some reactions on it.
All right, I'm going to get to that. I'm just going to quickly comment on the question of you mentioned 2 things at the beginning. One was decentralized finance, and how that can drive interest rates down, and the other is how money is created. Those are not actually separate, because what is it to create money? If you are a miser and have a chest of coins under your apple tree, are those coins actually money anymore?
Right.
They're not money unless they're in circulation. So if you have people with money that they're not using, it's not actually money unless it's being made use of. And this has to do with the velocity of money and stuff. So decentralized finance is actually part of this whole question. But I'll just jump into the natural.
And by the way, just to riff off of that, I mean, basically that's powerful, because it's suggesting that it is not just the system, it is not just banks or the government who has the potentiality to create money. It is all of us. We are effectively creating money when we put it to good use, basically.
Right. And the less that everyone holds on to their money and hoards it, the more money there is for everybody. And the faster money circulates, the more easily it circulates, the less you have to keep it.
Right.
So it can shift into a completely different kind of economy that draws, its inspiration maybe from ancient indigenous economies, where wealth was a matter of not how much you had, but how much you had given away.
Yeah, the
Because then everybody owes you one. Everybody wants to take care of you. Everybody's grateful to you. Everybody knows that you are a valuable contributing person.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah.
By the way, and out of curiosity, I see this a lot in the startup community, and the way that I see it is as follows. It's a little bit different. It's not money per se, but basically, there are a few consultants in the startup community who consult for pay, partly because startups are not, they don't have a lot of money to pay, and so basically what happens, and I think there's another reason for that, which is kind of, if you have started a company, you learn a tremendous amount, that you work really hard to learn, but it is only useful to other people. That body of knowledge is only useful for other people who are starting companies. So you want to give that knowledge away. So, I mean, when I was starting my first company, I got so much help for free. And as a consequence, I also give away help for free. And so you have effectively like a gift service economy happening there. And when you see that, you can imagine how that can scale. And so I just wanted to bring that up as an observation.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example of a gift economy. Like open source programming is another one.
Yeah.
People help each other out. Yeah. So so as far as like the natural capital-based currencies, you mentioned the idea of like maybe money's issued when you plant a tree or something like that. The danger there, of course, is that then people start planting trees willy-nilly, whether or not those trees are ecologically appropriate. So what we really want to move toward, and this is a problem of any metrics-based method of creating currency, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it or shouldn't base currencies in some way or associate them in some way with natural capital, with ecological healing or something like that. Like you can't really do that in a way that we're used to without quantifying. Like you have to quantify the contribution to natural healing if you're going to base a currency on it. Although that we could go in, actually, that may not be entirely true. But that's a much deeper dive. So I came up with this idea, this way of thinking, from a couple sources. One was just watching what was happening with carbon credits and what they were planning and trying to do, and the other was noticing that gold. I observed that most gold that has ever been mined is sitting in vaults. At least 2/3 of it. It's not being used for electronics. It's not being used for jewelry. It's just sitting there. So I'm like, well, why dig it out of one hole in the ground and put it in another hole in the ground called a vault? Why not just keep it in the ground? Why? And noticing that like anything that is associated with used as money, like in cultures where there's cattle, for example, cattle are used as money. In those places, people want more and more cattle, more than they could use for any other purpose, except for money. More and more gold that can be used for that is useful. It's not useful in that quantity. It's not. There it is, sitting there, So I'm like, well, okay, well, what if we, instead of gold dug out of the ground, what if it was gold in the ground? What if it was the ecosystems that are undisturbed because the gold is left in the ground? What if it is biodiversity intact that could be raised and strip mined and covered with a parking lot for money? But if that itself is the backing of money, then just like cattle or just like gold, we're going to want more and more of that. So that was kind of where the idea came from.
Yeah, it's like it's it's a beautiful and world-changing idea. And you wrote about this prior to the blockchain. And so I remember kind of uh, when I read it, I was both so inspired by the idea, and also like um, saddened because um, I remember kind of uh, like what it would require at the time to make that happen, and it involved like a number of agreements between local governments and regional governments and national governments, global governments, and so on. And I mean, I saw how much uh, um, like the process, for example, in town meetings in my 5,000 person town around like repaving the basketball court, for example. And I was like, how are we possibly going to make this happen? And um, and so I think more for the benefit of the audience than for this conversation, I'll kind of talk a little bit about kind of how we're thinking about this in the context of Celo, which is so the Celo, uh, um, uh, the protocol for Celo dollars works as follows. This is an oversimplified explanation, but it works as follows: is that um, the protocol continuously tracks the price of Celo dollars on the open market. If it goes above a US dollar, that means there's too much demand and too little supply. And so the protocol prints more Celo dollars and sells it on the open market in exchange for other crypto assets that it then puts into the reserve. The If the price goes below a US dollar, that means there's too much supply and too little demand. And so the protocol buys back on the open market Celo dollars using the reserve assets and retires it. And there are several features in place to address if there's volatility in the reserve assets. For example, initial over-collateralization, a Tobin tax, block rewards going to the reserve during times of need. But ultimately, kind of the main story is that the more Celo dollars in circulation, the bigger the reserve gets. So as Celo dollars in circulation grows, the bigger the reserve grows, basically. And so at the time that we started, there were no natural capital tokens, basically. There were no tokens representing forests, but we imagined at some point there would be, at which point the community could decide to do something like allocate a 30% allocation of the reserve to tokenized forest. And so that means as Celo dollars grows in circulation, that means the reserve grows, which means that 30% grows. That means the reserve starts programmatically buying and preserving forests. And so it's a super interesting time for now for this one, because we just put out the first of two RFPs for natural capital tokens to kind of go through a governance process where we start allocating natural capital tokens to the reserve, so that we could be a natural capital backed currency. Let me pause there and get your thoughts and reactions. I want to kind of talk a little bit about quantification, but I want to do so through a circuitous means. So, but first I want to pause and get your thoughts and reactions.
I won't say a lot. I was just a little bit curious / skeptical when you said it programmatically adds, whatever rainforest tokens or something like that, natural capital tokens. Like, what? How is it decided? Like, everything can't be algorithmic. At some point, human beings have to decide, okay, which maybe threatened land are we going to buy?
Yeah.
And like that is political and social and scientific decision.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That, you know, yeah, I just wanted to put that in there.
Well, no, I think I'm happy you brought that up, and I think that is a great point. And I think this is why kind of the rise of cryptocurrency has also led to a rise in thoughtfulness around governance. So this the specific question, I mean, what is algorithmic is like we don't want, or one doesn't want in designing a system, like for humans to have to get together every time there is a modest increase in the economy and say, okay, so which land now should we put in the reserve, or so on. That kind of thing is nicely done by computers, but like overall, the decision of what lands should be put in the reserve, how much should be put towards forest versus carbon credits versus clean rivers versus something else, and where, and so on. That is precisely a social question. It is a human question, and that cannot be outsourced to computers. And that is a governance question. So it is through governance that, I mean, this is all very fresh in the Celo ecosystem, so we haven't even put forth a governance proposal on this. But basically, it kind of we could take a view from how Celo currently runs in order to see how this will likely run, which is like changes to the protocol, changes to reserve assets, kind of the kinds of things that require changing the code. That is a human decision that goes through governance, and there's a governance proposal that people vote on. Once that governance proposal passes, then the code gets updated and it runs algorithmically until the next governance update, basically. And so that allows to kind of, I mean, in some ways one can think about code as laws here, and the governance process is the lawmaking process.
Right. Of course, like if your reserve consists of things like national currencies and cryptocurrencies and other highly liquid assets, it's easy to algorithmically change the reserve level in order to keep a constant Celo dollar value. But if you're talking about, say, threatened land in Brazil, or like, in a river watershed or something, I mean, you can't just there's no liquid market for that. I mean, you can't just buy and sell those things automatically. You have to, find a realtor, or you have to, or negotiate with a community who lives near there, or
yeah,
right, yeah.
I mean, one thought there, and these are early days, but one thought there is that one way to think about it is that you're actually selling the land itself, and you're buying and selling the land itself. So you split up the land into 1 acre parcels, and when it goes up, you buy another acre of land, and if the economy goes down, you sell that acre of land, basically, I don't think that is the ultimate answer. I think even that is a step up because it kind of ties growth to biodiversity, ecological conservation, all of the things that we want. But a better way to do it is to say, well, why don't we, instead of buying and selling the land, we buy the land, or one buys the land and preserves the land, and then and this gets back to kind of some of the things that you touch on, is then instead of buying and selling the land itself because the land is preserved, you buy and sell the ecosystem rights to the land. So one natural way to do that is you buy and sell the rights to the carbon credits that are generated buy that land, basically. And there is not yet a liquid market for that, although there's a somewhat liquid market for carbon credits. And so you can imagine there being a liquid market for ecosystem services that create carbon credits. And so that's the thing that could get bought and sold. And that has intrinsic value to the extent that those carbon credits have intrinsic value.
Yeah, I mean, we probably shouldn't go down this rabbit hole too much more, but maybe in the future we can talk about it. Like,
let's play around. I have a sense of where you'd say the ultimate goal is, which is actually I agree with, basically, which is like at a certain point, and that point is not now, but at a certain point, at a certain point, basically, you can imagine that, like, at the very least, you have 50% or some percentage that's backed by these forests that are never at risk of being sold off because the economy doesn't swing that wildly, basically, you know? And so then it starts looking like kind of it starts looking like just simply a new social agreement around kind of what we do in order to create the medium for exchange, rather than kind of something that pegs that pegs the dollar exactly. But yeah, I do want to. I mean, we've gone through 2 of 5 features, and we have just a few minutes left.
Right.
So I don't know exactly how to go through these next 3 in 5 minutes. Maybe what I'll do is, instead of doing that, we could schedule some more time at another Kuneco or on a Clubhouse or something like that. But instead, maybe if there are any questions, I could open it up to questions. And if not, we could basically kind of, there's a bunch of other things that I'd love to touch on. So if there's any questions, I mean, please feel free to type it into the Brella chat. And while we're waiting, I want to kind of touch on, I'm trying to think about, let me just touch on this. So basically kind of, one of the things we've both talked about is this idea that was put forth by Walter Wink, who's a philosopher and theologian, and he said, you know, like the founding myth of of really like the last 2,000 years is this myth of, or a founding myth of these last 2,000 years is the myth of redemptive violence. And the example that he uses is Popeye, and he says, you know, in every episode of Popeye, basically Bluto tries to abduct Olive Oyl. Popeye finds out, starts fighting Bluto. At a certain point, he's getting beaten badly. He eats his spinach. He gets strong, and he beats up Bluto and saves Olive Oyl. Good prevails over evil. Now, the downside and that myth is persistent everywhere, like movie lines, the way that we think about things like the war on poverty or the war on drugs or so on. But basically kind of what it misses is 2 things. One is nobody ever learns anything. I mean, Bluto never learns that it's not good to abduct Olive Oyl, and Popeye never learns to eat his spinach before getting into a fight instead of in the middle. And it also reifies the morphic field from which the first thing came from. Like basically kind of the fight against X, like means and ends are the same. And so like fighting against whatever it is often leads to a world with more fight. And so you've talked about an alternative, morphic resonance, which I'd love to kind of close off by hearing your kind of quick thoughts on morphic resonance.
Yeah. So I discussed the myth of redemptive violence at length in an essay called Building a Peace Narrative. And I referred to Walter Wink's work in that. And identified, and this has been a theme in my work for a long time, the basic formula for change making that we kind of take for granted in this society, which is you identify a bad guy and then you defeat the bad guy by force. You can see this in US foreign policy. You can see this in a lot of the political discourse today. You can see this in health policy. What's the bad guy? What's the pathogen? What's the bad thing in myself? You see it in spirituality, even like this war mentality. And there's a lot of problems with it. One of which is that you never ask, why is the bad guy bad? Or what are the conditions that allow the bad guy to be so powerful? And in the economic sphere, you could ask, as you mentioned before, like, why are certain people seemingly so greedy? Like, what is the system that creates the apparent psychopaths that run a lot of corporations? Are they really psychopaths, or are they merely in a certain position in that game of musical chairs that sets them up to act like that? If you are always out about, okay, we're going to solve the problem by tearing down those bad guys, tearing down those awful people, those greedy people, those bankers, those this, that, and the other thing, you're never going to look at the system. You're never going to, and sometimes maybe you do have to fight Pluto, but if that's all you do, you're in endless war. So the principle of morphic resonance is one of the alternatives to solving problems through overcoming something by force. And the paradigm of overcoming by force, it's not only in our politics and Hollywood movies and stuff. It's also like at the core of what we understand to be technology, where you're moving masses around by exerting forces on them. And progress in technology means more and more accurately doing that with more and more force. That's called progress. And it hits the same kind of glass ceiling that we talked about earlier. Like, there are certain things you can do incredibly well that way. And there are certain areas that we are seeing in our society now where that way of engaging the world fails. It doesn't produce the miraculous results that we had come to expect through the previous miraculous results. And so, and especially if you're facing a situation where the evil powers that be are so much more powerful than you are in terms of the amount of force they can apply, we have to tap into a different theory of change. And the one that you mentioned is morphic resonance, which says that any change that happens in one place creates a field of change so that the same change happens in other places. And that means, so any act of kindness, any act of generosity, it creates a field of kindness, a field of generosity, which means that your individual choices in the most intimate circumstances, the most humble circumstances, have a bigger effect on the world than the force-based mentality could conceive of. And it also has a bearing on projects like Celo or some of the cryptocurrencies, other, all of these, I mean, whatever beautiful project you have, like sometimes part of the mind is like, but this is just such a tiny drop in the bucket compared to everything that's happening in the world. Yet, by devoting to something that calls to your love and to your care and to your ideals, you're also instigating a morphic field, a field of change. And it could spread in ways that don't depend on how much marketing force you have behind it. One of the ways a morphic field spreads is through inspiration. Somebody hears about it. And there's maybe even more mysterious ways that it spreads. But you can be sure that any devoted attempt to bring into materiality, bring into this material social world, the ideals of interconnection, ecology, interbeing, the uniqueness and relatedness of all things, like these principles that are behind the founding of Celo, for example, like any attempt to do that with devotion will have an impact far beyond what we could predict.
Charles, wonderful. This is a perfect place to pause. I hope to have many of these kinds of conversations with an audience, because I feel like it was just a really nice way to connect with one another and with the community. So thank you so much, Charles, for being here. And Fernando.